Never walk alone on a wooded road, because you'll find something, or something will find you, that will change your life forever. My legs were exhausted. I'd been walking along that dark wooded road for about 3 hours by then, and my body was ready to call it quits. I missed the luxury of my car, but it had broken down several miles back, and my phone, it was dead. It had been dead since I got in the car. I was never very good about keeping my things charged, but at that time, I hated myself for it. I wanted to be home, warm in my bed, but I wouldn't even be close to my town for another 3 or 4 hours. About halfway there, I reminded myself, trying to keep the spirits up. I should have stayed in the car, part of me thought. Honestly, I only got out of the car, thinking that if I began walking, I could wave someone down and hitch a ride. But for the past 3 hours, not one person had stopped. In fact, not one person had passed by. It was the most quiet I'd ever seen this road. That was really saying something. I was very familiar with this place, as well as attached to it. Not only was it the quickest route to my grandparents' place, but it was also a place that my dad and I spent a lot of time in. There were miles upon miles of hiking trails in those woods, trails my dad and I were well acquainted with. Not only that, but I remember one occasion when my dad and I were driving back home from my grandparents, and on this very road, my dad encountered an injured deer. He stopped the car on the side of the road in hopes of helping the poor creature. I remember being so little, wondering what the two of us could do for an injured deer. I stayed in the car and watched through the windshield. The next thing I knew, my dad stood up, and so did the deer, which began to walk away, but stopped only for a moment to look back at my dad, as if to acknowledge the help. Then it turned and disappeared into the woods. When my dad walked back into the car, I asked him what he did. He said he had found a piece of glass in one of its hooves. How that deer got glass in his hoof, I don't know. But that day was a memory of my father that I would hold on to and cherish for the rest of my life. My father had been a good and kind man and a great dad. Sure, he and my mother fought a lot when I was a kid, but they loved each other dearly, passionately. Opposites attract, they say. And I do realize that my dad was never the same after my mom walked out on us when I was younger. But in spite of his faults and everything he's ever done for me, I love and miss that man. Because when I turned 14, my dad passed away. I miss him dearly. Ever since then, I cherished my time driving on this road and walking in the woods around it. Thinking about my father as I walked along the dark road, I was suddenly reminded about a particular negative memory. A specific part of this road that my dad was always wary of. You see, there was this portion of the road. It wasn't much different from the other parts of it, save for one thing. A near ancient stump that had been there for as long as I could remember. The part of the stump that faced the road. It was covered in fungus and moss. I noticed that insects would land on that side with ease. The other side, facing the woods, it was all dark and rotted. A disgusting color between gray and brown that no natural living thing should be. Yet despite that half of it looking so awful, it never did cave in or fall away. Never did seem to rot away at all. It always looked like if you kicked it real good on that side, it would just smush in on itself, like some sort of old soggy log. But I never dared try, never dared get close to it. I had no reason to be afraid of the stump. It was only because of my dad's fear that drove me to inherit it. As I said before, my dad and I would walk in these woods, even along the roads. But every time we'd come close to this stump, he would lead me away from it, taking a much larger detour so as to not come close to it. I even saw his wariness of it when we drove down this road. He wouldn't look at it, and he would stay completely quiet during that segment, no matter how much I tried to push him into a conversation or even ask why he was so weird about that stump. He would stay quiet until he could no longer see it in his rear view, and if he was driving towards it and saw it coming up in the distance, he would quickly speed up a good 10 or 15 miles per hour just to get past it more quickly. And as I remembered that old stump, I also recalled that I hadn't passed it yet, and I would be coming up on it soon enough. I continued to walk and walk and walk, becoming more and more creeped out as I got closer to it. Then again, walking alone on a dark road at night, getting a little bit creeped out is sort of inevitable. About 20 minutes later, I saw its silhouette forming in the distance in front of me. Of course, I was walking on the same side of the road as it. I hadn't even thought about that. I walked a little faster now, mirroring my dad's actions when he used to see the stump. I even instinctively tried to avoid looking at it directly. But as I began to remember my dad and think of him more, I began to feel more and more empowered, silly, thinking that surely my dad wouldn't want me scared of the stump as well. Besides, it could have just been me reading too much into things when I was younger. I was at a full sprint, ignoring my sore legs. About 2 minutes later, I was standing right in front of the thing. It hadn't changed a bit. The left side where the road was lush with color. It was thick with moss and fungus, alive with nighttime insects. A moth rested on one of the mushrooms. A snail searched for food under one of the mushroom caps, and a firefly light strobed on one of the patches of moss. I turned my head only slightly. Even now, the dark side of the stump appeared ready to collapse at any moment. I thought to myself, I could probably just breathe on it, and the wood would fall in. Would probably be doing people favors, so they wouldn't have to look at that nasty side of the stump from now on. With a sigh and a smirk, I walked over to that side of the thing. I felt way too confident. Here sat this thing that my father was afraid of for so long. Maybe, just maybe, I might do him a favor. I took a couple of steps back, then got a decent running start. Placing all of my weight into my left foot, I kicked at the side of the rotten end of the stump. For some reason, I expected it to be rough, hard. Expected my kick to have no effect, as if there was some sort of magical property to this dang stump. But when my foot made contact, I could barely feel anything. It was like kicking a big wet sponge. A landslide of bark flew off of the thing, the rotten side of the stump nearly separating itself perfectly from the lush side. I smiled for a moment, catching my breath after the sudden outburst. I looked down at the mush of old bark, and before I could feel triumph at what I had done, I covered my mouth and held back a scream. There, under the bark that I had just kicked, there was a hand. A withered hand nearly the same color as that rotten wood around it. Horrified, I dropped to the ground. I couldn't believe what I was looking at. I found myself crawling closer, needing to know if it was really a human hand that was poking through the soil. I crawled with utter reluctance toward the stump, or what remained of it, driven only by morbid curiosity. When I was next to it, I began to dig and pull at the soil that was loose with my hands. As I revealed more of what was underneath, I stopped, now unable to breathe. It was a face, withered just as much as the hand, if not more, but a face that was recognizable nonetheless. A face I recognized. It was my mother. I wanted to throw up. I wanted to keel over right then and there, to be lost to that wooded road, like my mother, apparently. And as my mind could not form a proper thought, as if on cue by some higher power who had been waiting for me to make this discovery, an old pickup truck drove by, saw me on the side of the road, and stopped. An old man asked me if I was okay. I couldn't even look at him. But sure enough, he followed my gaze to the stump. He cursed under his breath, running back to his truck to grab his phone and call the police. Later on, forensics revealed that it was in fact my mother. My mother who never ran away. My mother who never abandoned us. My mother who had been killed by my father and buried under this old tree stump. I now know why my dad feared it, and I can't help but wonder if that side of the stump rotted like that as a signal, one last cry for help from my late mom.